Just some quick preliminary comments before I turn it over to Stephen Mintz, who's so kindly agreed to be the expert to walk us through this important era of history. The first thing I guess I wanted to say, which is that we're dealing with a period of slavery in the United States, which is very painful. It's I call it the original sin of the United States. The racism that caused it and the racism that's still a legacy from it is a very difficult social issue. And in no way, by dealing with other aspects of the era, technology, business, finance, do we want to diminish the very painful things that came about and the brutality and the torture that came about in slavery. And I think I speak for myself and Stephen that we want to emphasize that up front. The second thing, I guess, we just really want to explain a little why are we talking about this era of history? When I started preparing to teach my interns this summer, someone gave me a course syllabus of the history of economics in the United States, and cotton was on there, and I didn't know anything about cotton. And all I wanted to do is jump from the period of the founding fathers to the Civil War and Grant, and to kind of ignore all the ugliness in between. And I certainly didn't think anything of economic significance happened. And as we're about to talk about, I was really, really wrong on that. It was really the first stage of factories, and in many ways, the stepping stone between an agrarian economy and the industrial economy that we recognize today, the consumer economy. So that's really what we're going to talk about. So again, the links to today are the takeaways for today that I want us to listen for are how technological improvements can have a dramatic effect on industry and society, number one. And again, which we'll talk about, is the role of finance in this era and what people thought about it, and, if you will, how unpretty that story is as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve. Thank you again for doing this, Steve.
My pleasure. So let's start here. It's a great irony that slavery laid the foundation for a modern commercial, consumer-oriented industrial economy. And it's that paradox that we're going to address today. 4 industries have transformed the global economy over time: automobiles and railroads and computers, but the first was cotton and cotton textiles. Now, the impact of railroads, automobiles, and computers is obvious to us. These industries not only created a huge demand for raw materials, but transformed the environment around us and spawned a host of new businesses. But what we're going to see is that what we sleep on, our sheets, and what we wear, our clothes, are central to creating a new modern economy. The textile industry would have truly a revolutionary impact. It ushered in the world of modern capitalism and the modern industrial economy. It was responsible for the rise of wage labor. It created the modern factory. It reshaped the lives of people everywhere around the world. It was the first to replace human power and animal power with mechanical power. And it resulted in masses of women and men spending their days inside factories. But that's not all, of course. This textile revolution made washable clothing readily available. Imagine wearing clothes that you could not wash, and therefore you wore until they discriminated. This revolution would eliminate many traditional forms of women work inside the home and would ultimately devastate textile production in India, Africa, and elsewhere. And above all, it would spark the expansion of slavery, which in turn would stimulate the growth of banking, insurance, commerce, meatpacking, industry after industry. So in the story we're going to talk about, we see both the positive and negative sides of the Industrial Revolution. It would bring tremendous improvements in living standards, but its success would depend on the exploitation of labor. And yet, on the other hand, it fostered a new kind of economy, an economy driven by consumers, and would greatly improve their well-being. And here we'll see the interconnections between technology, finance, slavery, and a modern economy. So why did the Industrial Revolution take place? You can read books on the subject, but in a nutshell, the answer was consumer demand. Existing clothing production couldn't meet consumer demand. Consumers wanted inexpensive, washable, colored clothing, and necessity proved to be the mother of invention. To increase productivity, inventors invented a whole series of new machines. They automated the process by which thread was woven, and they automated the process of weaving clothing. But what textile manufactured lacked was a cheap source of cotton. By the 1780s, they had reached the end of their rope. That is, all the cotton that could be produced was being manufactured into clothing, and it was a mere fraction of what consumers demanded. And then an inventor, Eli Whitney, would revitalize the institution of slavery. Now, as many of you know, even if Eli Whitney had not invented the cotton gin, he would be well known because he invented the American system of production, that is the use of interchangeable parts. But it would be his invention of the cotton gin that would be utterly transformative. As late as 1790, most educated people were convinced that slavery was on the road to extinction. Imports of Africans into the New World, especially into what's now the United States, had diminished and had declined. The northern states had all abolished slavery or adopted gradual emancipation plans. White Southerners freed tens of thousands of slaves. The fastest growing portion of the American population consisted of free Blacks. And then that invention in 1792 changed everything. Instead of being a possible dying industry, demand for tobacco, rice had been saturated. Demand for slaves soared, just as tobacco production declined. So the number of slaves rose from 700,000 in 1807 to 3 million in 1860. And those enslaved African Americans would be moved from the coast into the cotton kingdom of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, all lands that had been occupied by the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Creek, and other Indian peoples. And so what we have is an extraordinary movement of peoples. Tens of thousands of Native Americans pushed into Oklahoma, and 1 million African Americans moved into the Cotton Kingdom, all within a space of roughly 30 years. Now, what the cotton gin did is it simply removed the seeds from short staple cotton, which was much easier to grow than long staple cotton. A single slave could remove 24 times more cotton, produce 25 times more cotton because of the cotton gin. And so cotton production expanded from 1.5 million pounds in 1790 to 36.5 million, not much later. So by 1860, the slave South produced somewhere close to 90% of all the cotton used by the European textile industry.
Steve, I'm going to interrupt for a poll, and if people could use the chat. There was obviously no global ban on the production of cotton outside the United States. So where was there a growth in, before the United States kind of took over, if you will, where was a lot of the growth in production? And you can give me either a continent or a region or countries. So I see India, Asia, England, UK, no cotton ever in England. Boo. Too cold there, or wet. I don't know, one of it is. Asia, South America. Okay, Steve, you want to start to answer that?
You know, cotton was ideally suited for the southeastern United States. And it would be as if the United States had a monopoly on oil in the world. That is if you have a monopoly supply of an essential commodity, the income that can be generated from that is fantastic. If you divided the world up in 1860, if you divided the United States up, Britain was the wealthiest place in the world. The North was the second wealthiest place in the world. And the South was the third wealthiest place in the world. And the South was as wealthy per capita in 1860 as Italy was in 1939, before the war, and as Mexico was in 1965. So having this monopoly, which turned out, of course, to be temporary, was a source of extraordinary wealth, but not just for planters.
So what I had in mind was the Caribbean and Brazil were competing for cotton production because they also used slavery. It just wasn't able to be at the scale that the South was. And one of the constraints of other regions of the world as well was land control. What we did in the South was basically just stole the land and converted it to cotton production. Whereas in other countries, Turkey and India in particular, the political system did not allow for that. It was more traditional. But anyway, we can move forward. I just like to imagine a world in which maybe it didn't happen in the South, but obviously the physical conditions were important too.
In the Caribbean and Brazil, they mainly grew sugarcane. Sugarcane is a terrible crop to produce, but it had unlimited demand. To refine sugar, they would have furnaces that would heat up the sheds to 120 degrees, just terrible working conditions. But whenever you have a monopoly, somebody is going to puncture that monopoly. And what the Europeans did, they were so dependent on the Caribbean for sugar that they started to grow sugar beets instead of sugar cane, and were able to undo that. And what we'll see is during the Civil War, when cotton supplies were cut off from the South, there were plenty of other areas, Egypt, India, and the like, where you could grow cotton. So the Civil War turned out to be a bad mistake for planters who thought cotton was king. Well, cotton may have been king, but that didn't mean one region would monopolize production. But lots of people could make money from this expanding industry. The South, precisely because it focused on cotton production, did not develop banks. It did not develop transportation systems. It did not develop insurance companies. It did not develop meat production and the like. It did not develop textiles. And so that created huge openings for others, some in the South, like the Lehman Brothers, but mainly in New York City. And one thing that you may vaguely know from a history class is that in 1861, the mayor of New York City called for New York to secede from the Union and become an independent city-state because its future was aligned with the South. Now, let's go on. The Industrial Revolution would transform life in the North and in the South. In the North, there was a shortage of skilled labor, and that encouraged the adoption of machines. And in 1820, a group of Boston investors created the first consolidated textile mills in the world, where you could turn raw cotton into cloth. And in order to try to avoid the evils of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, they employed the unmarried daughters of New England farmers. Those daughters had previously spent their lives making clothing for their family, but now instead they could go to work in a mill town and bring home income, which they far preferred. A new word entered the English language during this period. The word was girlhood. But when they referred to girls, they referred to girls the way Madonna refers to girls, not little girls, but girls in their teens and 20s who, for the first time in human history, were free from the control of a father or a husband. They had a period of life of relative freedom. They didn't hate working in the mills. They viewed the mills as a temporary expedient when they were in the company of sisters. So it's very interesting to me to see that. However, in the 1840s, those young women were replaced by immigrant women from Ireland due to the potato famine. Now, the textile industry's voracious demand for cotton transformed the South into one of the richest parts of the world. Well over half of the nation's millionaires lived in the South. But what's interesting to me is that while this system was enormously profitable for individual planters, it produced a very unbalanced economy in the South. Slavery would generate an ideology in the South that was hostile towards cities, towards factories and towards technological innovation. The South's economy failed to develop internal markets. It failed to develop a diversified economy. It failed to develop large cities. It failed to develop a transportation network to connect cities. It failed to attract immigrants. So by 1860, there are 1.3 million industrial workers in the North and 110,000 in the South. 90% of industrial production took place in the North. The transportation network was extremely primitive. To travel from Baltimore to New Orleans required you to take 5 railroads, 2 stagecoaches, and 2 steamboats. Like in third world areas, the transportation network simply pointed towards ports, but it didn't create an internal market. Public schools didn't develop either in the South. Those only will occur after the Civil War. And 20% of the white population was illiterate. And when I mean illiterate, literally not able to write their own name. And all this, I think, should sound a bit familiar to us, because we can think of other economies that are resource rich, but overly dependent on a single natural resource. Extractive economies, like those in large parts of the Middle East, do not take their profits and invest it in a more sustainable economic system. So the South, again, generated enormous wealth, but it didn't channel that wealth into modern modes of production. Now, many of our images of the slave South are permeated by myths. Large slaveholders were extremely rare. There were only 111,000 Southerners, Southern families that owned 50 or more slaves. Only 2,300 owned as many as 100 slaves. And 3/4 of white Southern families owned no slaves.
Steve, can I just stop here? I want to do a little finance interjection. So, and maybe we'll try this on chat again. So did slave owners get the money to buy slaves from their own savings, from outside shareholders, or from bank loans? All right, we're doing well. We're doing well. So the banks and savings were the two leading answers. And yes, bank financing. Evidently, some planters did not need to have a lot of their own money because they had 2 assets. One was land, which was very illiquid, but the other was their slaves. And banks lent against slaves as collateral, and they even bundled them up. And I guess that involved Southern banks, but it also involved foreign banks as well. So going back to my point about it's not just the South, it's also, and I'm going to especially tag England with this, there were investors from England that came in and financed the purchase of slaves. So there was definitely no clean hands. And I say that only because Britain outlawed slavery in 1834. They never really had a lot of slaves, in England, and the international slave trade was closed in 1808. So there's this sort of, abolitionist movement or whatever you want to call it, but there was an intense financial and link and economic interdependency. Steve, I don't know if you have any other points
Well,
to.
the only point that I would add is, the Southern economy was heavily dependent on debt, and the planters did not have a lot of liquid capital. And therefore, you had a tax system that was raised very little revenue. So one of the reasons they don't have a school system is they don't have sufficient taxes in order to support a school system. And we can see a little bit of the legacy of that today. When you think of what are the low tax regions of this country, Texas, Florida, these were the slaveholding regions in the past. They developed a culture during this time period that discouraged high levels of taxation because people lacked the capital, lacked the liquid finance to pay taxes. Now, compared to slavery in the Caribbean and in Brazil, American slavery was far different. The plantations were much smaller. They typically would have 25 or fewer slaves, where in the Caribbean, many plantations had 1,000 slaves. Because the plantations were relatively small, there was a lot of interaction with masters and slaves. But it also meant that revolts were very uncommon in the South. Resistance would take other forms, shirking, sabotage, running away, and especially cultural resistance, that is, through religion or folklore. So the slave system in the South is quite different. And historians have to deal with a paradox. In purely material terms, American slaves were better off than Caribbean slaves. They lived longer, they got more nutrition. On the other hand, it was probably better to be if you had to be a slave in the Caribbean. There was so much supervision, so little privacy, so little freedom from the master class in the South. It was quite different in the Caribbean, where generally 90 to 95% of the population consisted of slaves. Now, the early stages of industrialization depended upon slavery to furnish the raw materials that would fuel factories. But ironically, industrialization also promoted an ideology hostile towards slavery. The lords of the loom would be the same people who would finance the anti-slavery movement. What a paradox, right? You might think that these capitalists who just wanted the cheapest possible labor would have been opponents of abolition. But in fact, many of them supported anti-slavery, which really poses a challenge for historians. And the reason is they want to legitimate free labor. They want to legitimate wage labor as utterly superior to coerced labor. And so they develop an ideology of the self-made man who raises himself up from rags to riches, who works hard and gets ahead, and no one articulated that ideology more powerfully than a railroad attorney from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. He very much helped articulate this view, which is slavery is fundamentally opposed to progress, even though it had initially provided the fuel for industrialization. And so by the 1850s in the United States, slavery and industrialization are viewed as antithetical, And that would ultimately pave the way to the Civil War. Now, I just want to say a few last thoughts and connect this story we've been telling to the Civil War and its aftermath. Slavery was not dying in 1860. Indeed, even after the Civil War began, slave prices were still rising. And slavery could have been highly adaptable. Slaves were used in construction. They helped build the Capitol and the White House. They were used in shipping. They were used in skilled crafts. And even in the South's few factories, slaves were used as factory operatives. And so it is completely imaginable to me that in the absence of the Civil War, slavery might have evolved into something like apartheid in South Africa. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln in 1858 predicted that slavery would last another 100 years. And he added that if he had all the power on earth, he had no idea how to end it. Soon he would have all that power. Slavery was increasingly viewed by free workers as a threat to progress, as a vestige of barbarism from the past. And Northerners increasingly regarded white Southerners as a violent, uneducated people. Northerners increasingly saw slavery not only as an impediment to social services like schools, but to opportunity. The Civil War was much more than a war about union or even a war about slavery. It was the largest conflict in the Western world between the Napoleonic Wars that ended at Waterloo and World War I. It represented the single biggest challenge to the triumph of industrial capitalism. The slave states, as long as they were in the Union, obstructed the growth of industry in this country. They opposed a national currency. They opposed a central banking system. They opposed government investment in infrastructure. They opposed a high protective tariff. They opposed government aid to education. And they criticized Northern factories as embodiments of what they called wage slavery. So when the South left the Union in 1861, the Republican-controlled Congress was now able to put into foundation a new order. Now, many of the business titans, Carnegie, Morgan, Pullman, Rockefeller, and others, would get the capital that they needed for their second generation industrial revolution from the war itself. They were among the many profiteers from the Civil War. But more important, Congress took steps that created the foundation for a new industrial order. It was during the Civil War that Congress began construction of the transcontinental railroad network. It was during the Civil War that Congress passed the Homestead Act, providing free land in the West to anyone who would move. It was during the Civil War that Congress created land-grant colleges. It was during the Civil War that Congress created a national banking system and a uniform national currency. It was during the Civil War that Congress imposed a high protective tariff to encourage the growth of industry. So the Civil War was truly the second American Revolution. It opened the door to a new industrial revolution that would go well beyond cotton textiles and wouldn't be dependent on slave labor, but would instead produce steel and railroads and other capital goods that would provide the foundation for America's dominance of the global economy. Jan, that's what I have to say.
Steve, that's great. I'm going to open it up to questions in a second. If you could stop sharing, I can't get through any kind of discussion without showing a couple of charts. And so before I do that, I wanted to ask if you could use your chat again. Do you think that the price of cotton during this period, let's call it 1800 to 1860, went up a lot, a little, was flat, or went down? The price of raw cotton. Oh, it seems about 50-50 between up and down. So here is a chart of cotton from Sven Beckert's book that goes back pretty far. So before production really accelerated, there was a spike, but every now, this is the thing about finance, it depends on how you interpret this chart. But for me, given the explosion in the quantity of production in the South, the fact that prices roughly stayed in this range of, I don't know, 50 to 150 pence, I thought was relatively stable, again, given the quantities are going up. You know, economics will tell you normally that when quantity goes up that much, you know, prices should fall. So I don't know, Steve, if you had a comment on this chart.
And what will happen after the Civil War is the supply will skyrocket as India, Egypt, and other societies begin to produce large amounts of cotton too. But the great irony of that is that for individual farmers, their production increased, but their earnings went down. So American farmers by 1890 are producing more than twice as much cotton as they did in 1860, and their incomes are half as much.
So just a couple of, you know, I said at the beginning, I was really intrigued by the technology of cotton, the production of textiles, taking raw cotton, which is what you're sort of looking at here, and making it fabric. And how Britain was able to compete in this, even though it had the highest labor costs. And the answer was technology. So to give you just one factoid, spinning, because of the spinning jenny, spinners in England were 50 times more productive than spinners in India at the same period of time. They were saying that over a course of 30 years in England, productivity of textile production increased 370 times. It's almost numbers that are mind-boggling, but it's really what made them the global center of manufacturing, is that their costs were so much lower. And so that would just takes us to my next chart. And this is not the price of cotton, but the price of cotton yarn. And so it's I guess maybe halfway through the step of textile production. I'm oversimplifying here. And you can just see the dramatic fall in the costs, that, as we would say these days, the deflationary impact of technology. And again, this is just part of the step. This is only to the getting to the yarn. It's not the weaving and production of textiles, which was further deflationary. And that's what made these consumer goods so affordable, you know, to everyone. So I think those points are really important. And then I wanted to point out as well how the UK was coupled to the production of cotton, raw cotton in the US, cotton was the most, by some measures, important part of the UK economy in 1831. It was 22% of the value added. The second most was also textile wool, which was 14%, and iron and coal each were only about 7%. So 1 out of 6 workers in England worked in the cotton manufacturing or the textile manufacturing process. So it was transformative for the South. It was transformative for England, and they were really coupled. And Steve made some great points about finance and the ties and implications really way beyond the production of raw cotton to the other parts of the economy. And anyway, so that's it. I'm going to open it up. We have plenty of time for questions. I think the best way to do that is in the chat area. But if you have any questions, this would be a great time to put it in there. So one question, what portion of global cotton did the US produce?
Well, in 1860, they're producing 75 to 90% of all the cotton that's being used by the European and British textile industries. There was a pretty substantial textile industry in India, but it simply couldn't compete against British textiles or American textiles. You know, this is a story of winners and losers. And it's easy to point to some of the obvious winners, which are, of course, planters and textile mill owners. But we also need to remember that consumers were big beneficiaries of this. So you have, like most forms of progress in human history, a lot of trade-offs and a lot of winners and losers.
So this is a long question. Britain had a schizophrenic relationship with both the North and South during the Civil War. How much of that was protecting supply of cotton and how much of it was protecting investment in cotton production in the South?
Okay, during the Civil War, unemployment in Britain skyrocketed with essentially 1/6 of the economy ruined because of the cutoff of Southern cotton. And yet, what was striking is the working class demanded that Britain not intervene on the side of the South, as many aristocrats wanted to do, but rather that it should support the North. And of course, had Britain intervened on the side of the South, then it is very likely that the South could have prevailed in the Civil War, just as the United States had prevailed in the Revolution thanks to French support. But the payoff for the working class, for the suffering they underwent during the Civil War, was that in 1867, Britain extended the vote to the working class, in large part as a sort of repayment for the suffering they had undergone during the Civil War.
This question has come up. Beyond indentured slaves, was convict slavery used in America or just Australia?
Well, you've all probably heard of the convict lease system, which was widely used in the South after the Civil War. It was not used so much in farming, it was mainly used in mining. Under pig laws, you steal a pig, you got 10 years of convict labor. And the death rate among convicts ranged anywhere from 10% to 25% per year, because convicts are, of course, utterly expendable.
Okay, another question. The 1619 Project podcast suggests that the system of quotas, which I assigned as homework, I don't know if anyone did it, the system of quotas and violence against cotton plantation slaves laid the groundwork for US's oppositional labor management philosophy.
There's been a lot of debate by professional historians about the 1619 Project. And I want to present as best I can a balanced view. Every historian, every serious historian believes that slavery was central to American politics, American economic development in the decades before the Civil War. No one doubts that, but there is a lot of specifics where there is disagreement with the positions that the New York Times took, because they did not rely on scholars to vet the project. So, for example, what percentage of American economic growth is attributable to slavery? And the best answer for economic historians is somewhere around 15%, 15%, where the Times' story places this at well over half. No reputable historian would say that. It's the internal market that developed. It was other forms of industry that developed that were the major contributors to American economic growth. Now, this is not to relegate slavery to the margins. It's just that the subject is more complicated than the New York Times treated it.
Yeah, I mean, in the portion that I recommended people listen to, I think they throw out a lot of different ideas, and I think it's just it's helpful and provocative. I don't think it's clearly not meant to be scientific research, right? It's raising awareness as much as anything.
I shouldn't go much into this, but let me just add 2 points that might, I think, be relevant. One point that the Times downplays is the biracial struggle against slavery and for civil rights. The movement to defeat slavery was not simply, it was a broad-based movement that involved hundreds of thousands of white Northerners who were, in the end, willing to sacrifice their own lives to end slavery. And another point that the 1619 Project makes, it very much belittles Abraham Lincoln and treats him, as we used to say back in the 1960s, as a honky. But most historians believe that Lincoln grew over time, and most historians believe that that pragmatic, practical politician was absolutely indispensable in ending slavery. That had he been more ideological, had he been more radical, he would never have been elected president. He would never have been nominated for the presidency. And he wouldn't have had the political skill to bring slavery to an end. Just take a look at the Steven Spielberg movie on Lincoln, and you see what a master politician looks like and how he can get, in that case, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery passed through Congress. Not easy.
Maybe getting to back to a little bit more of a finance-oriented question. Yeah. So what happened to the South's finances when this industry, this revenue source went away and there was a naval blockade?
Well, after the Civil War, the South goes from being the third wealthiest region in the world, behind Britain and the North, to really a basket case. By 1890, the South, which has over a third of the nation's population, has something like 10% of the nation's economy. The South was becoming a region that produced raw materials, whether it was bauxite or oil or other raw materials, and that produced farm crops and did low production activities like making cigarettes or processing tobacco or making turpentine. In other words, once they lost their monopoly over the supply of cotton, their economy was in deep trouble. And there's a lesson there, I think, which is resilience is super important in an economy. And while you can get monopoly profits for a short period of time, if you're not ready to adjust, if you're not flexible, the results can be catastrophic.
Steve, one of my points about this area is just focusing on the technology. And one aspect of technology is the respect for intellectual property rights. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I'm happy to, with respect to the invention of the cotton gin and how its use multiplied, and also how textile production in the Northeast United States was transferred from the UK.
What would you like me to talk about in that, please?
Well, just maybe I'll start with the cotton gin, which is my understanding is that basically it was patentable, but that people just copied it, copied the machine, and then the states ended up cutting a deal, I think, with Eli Whitney just to say, okay, we'll give you a certain cut of all the cotton that's produced in the state for a period of time. So I think about China a lot. People are very critical, rightfully so, of some of the theft of intellectual property that goes on there. I just wanted to say it was not non-existent in the South, as the cotton gin was used in the South. And I believe also that some of the textile manufacturing in the Northeast was borrowed and from England, and some of the workers and knowledgeable workers were recruited from England to come to the Northeast. So I wouldn't say it was an era of incredibly strict intellectual property protection and enforcement. Is that fair?
Absolutely right. In the 1790s, Britain made it a crime to export information about the technology used to process cotton. The state of Pennsylvania, among others, offered bounties to anyone who was knowledgeable and would come to the United States. And one man did. And the Pennsylvanians actually set up the mill in Rhode Island. You can still see it today, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, the first factory in the United States that was designed by one of those British emigres who violated the law and provided the model for future textile factories. His workforce consisted of 7 children, all aged 7 to 12, and he discovered something that would have huge implications. These children were more productive than adults who worked at home, and they worked hard because they were supervised and because their overseer would pour water on their heads when they weren't working. But it taught factory owners that it made sense to consolidate workers under a single roof with a supervisor. And then once you consolidated workers under a single roof, someone could watch how the workers worked and could figure out how to automate it. So the first factories were not machine driven. They were simply consolidations of workers. But once you've consolidated them, you can figure out how to mechanize their production.
Maybe, I think this is probably a yes answer, but which is a summary of, I think, what we've been covering. But is it accurate to say that slavery would not have grown as much as it did if not for the support of the banks, the land available, the technological innovations in cotton production, the consumer demand for cotton products, and the mindset of plantation owners?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, it's the $64,000 question that historians can't answer because it's a sort of what if. During the American Revolution, about a third of all the slaves in South Carolina fled, and about the same percentage fled in Georgia. And yet, despite this, they were able to reestablish and perpetuate the slave system. And after the American Revolution, many Americans were convinced that slavery would die out. But who can rest assured that that was the case in the absence of the cotton gin? Hard for us to know, unknowable altogether. The population of enslaved Africans would have continued to grow, right? Because you have an equal sex ratio. So exactly what would have happened is very unclear. Now, the founders of our nation were convinced that slavery was on the road to extinction for the most part, but historians are more doubtful about that in the absence of the cotton gin.
Interesting. I think this, we'll finish up with maybe just some, I'll call them more history rather than market structure kind of questions. But here's one that's sort of in the middle. Did the lack of infrastructure in the South cause the Civil War to last longer than it might have otherwise?
Well, my own view is that it hurt the South more than it hurt the North. True, the North could not use the South's railroad system, but it had tremendous engineering capabilities that it put to work. The problem was that Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals couldn't move their troops around very effectively. And so when as many of you know, the Union strategy called the Anaconda Plan divided the South into 3 sectors. And the fact is you could then defeat one sector at a time, and there was nothing the South could do about that because they couldn't move their troops eastward and westward. So I think that the South was the true losers from the lack of infrastructure.
This is our last question. One of the big financial events during this time period was the Panic of 1837. Can you speak to that maybe just a little bit in terms of causes and consequences, magnitude?
Okay, there's 3 big panics in the United States. One in 1819, one in 1839, and one in 1857. And in each case, these panics really exacerbate sectional tensions because the question is, what do you do to get out of these recessions, these depressions? And one answer embraced by the North is, well, you impose protective tariffs in order to protect American industry and promote its growth. And if you're the South, you say, if you impose tariffs, then Europe will retaliate. And since all of the things that we export are growing in the South, cotton, tobacco, rice, and the like, sugar, we're going to be the ones who will suffer from the retaliation. And so these recessions become great points of division.
And what caused them?
Well, there's the Panic of 1839 used to be blamed on Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson required the country to pay its taxes with specie, with gold and silver. And of course, there's not enough gold and silver. But that explanation turned out to be wrong. Economic historians who've studied this discovered that the problem was China, that Europe and the United States wanted to import goods from China, but they didn't have an effective commodity that the Chinese wanted, so that there was limited trade. So what if you could think of a product that had unlimited demand, and it was a New Yorker named Warren Delano who came up with the answer. And the answer was black dirt. That is opium from Turkey and India. Now, the Chinese government, the emperor, tried to put a halt to this, but a war broke out, and it's one of the few wars in world history named by the losers. It's called the Opium Wars, which forced China to import opium. As for Warren Delano, who made a fortune, he moved back to New York. He married a neighbor, and the neighbor and he had a daughter named Sarah Delano. She married another neighbor, James Roosevelt, and they had a child, and you know that child, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, whether FDR actually knew how his family fortune came to be is a mystery to historians, but behind every great fortune, Victor Hugo wrote, there is a great crime. Well, I don't know if that's true, but it was certainly true in the case of the Roosevelts.
I thought New Yorkers were going to get through this hour unscathed, but I guess it didn't happen. Well, listen, I want to thank you very much, Steve. I also want to thank Jim Basker, who runs something called the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Two good New Yorkers helped fund that effort, which promotes the understanding of history. They educate high school teachers, and they have a lot of educational programs. And we're going to try to work through them. This effort that we're hosting is really to try to enhance education, historical literacy in the financial services sector, and any ideas you all have in helping us further that goal. Tell your neighbors, tell your coworkers. That would be great. So thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome. It's really been my pleasure to meet you all, if only virtually.
We'll see you all next week. It's another transformative technology, railroads, that really transforms another area of the country, Chicago and sort of Buffalo and areas like that, and also is responsible for a lot of wealth creation. So look forward to that, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.